We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Welcome back, dear listener. This is the Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcast. It's a weekly podcast. We talk about news, politics, religion, sex, the things that are going on in the world, things that affect our society, what's happening to our society. Is it moving forwards, backwards? What are the trends? What's happening of interest? So that's what we do every week. Normally there's a panel of 3, but on this occasion Scott can't join us. So it's just 2 of us. It's myself, Trevor, aka the Iron Fist, and with me, Paul, the 12th man.
Greetings, Earthlings, and greetings, Trevor. I'm sure Scott's with us in spirit, so to speak.
He would be in spirit, yeah. So we've got a special episode, Paul. We're going to talk about Indigenous matters.
Yes.
We're going to wrap up as best we can the sorts of things we've been saying about Indigenous issues and sort of try and summarise positions and just have it all in one spot, because we've picked away at it for 4 years and I've kept notes of everything we've said and topics and articles we've come across, and I've gathered them all together, and I've got a Word document in front of me that's 32 pages long.
Wow.
So we're probably not going to get through all of it.
How many pages of that is the complaints from listeners?
That's to come. So that's true. It's a tricky one, isn't it?
It's a contentious topic, and we're well aware of that.
Yeah.
We know we're venturing into risky territory.
Yeah. So we'll see where it takes us. But we're going to talk about Indigenous issues and our position. And I like to think that on a lot of issues I'm quite left-wing, I think, these days, more so than I was 4 years ago.
That's
very much
interesting.
into, looking after the poor and the oppressed, the disadvantaged.
You have a heart of gold.
Thanks.
Trevor.
Give them a leg up. But lots of people on the left have a different view and approach to the Indigenous issues than what I would have.
Yeah.
So
And that's interesting because, I've always considered myself left of centre as well, and yet, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've noticed my views on certain things diverging from what, perhaps the majority of left-leaning people would take as well. Yeah.
And it really matches up with identity politics in the same way that we both have a problem with identity politics, which the left in many cases has adopted. So it's really part and parcel of the same thing, I think.
Indeed.
So, dear listener, if this is the first time you've joined us, we're not racists. In fact, I would argue...
Just the fact that you've denied being a racist makes you a racist in some people's estimation, Trevor.
Indeed, yeah. I would argue many of the people in favour of lots of Indigenous action at the moment are in fact the racists. So I just quickly grabbed a little definition from Wikipedia, which I thought to me made sense. Racism is the belief in the superiority of one race over another. It may also include prejudice, discrimination or antagonism directed against other people because they are of a different race or ethnicity, or the belief that members of different races or ethnicities should be treated differently. Modern variants of racism are often based in social perceptions of biological differences between peoples. These views can take the form of social actions, practices or beliefs, or political systems in which different races are ranked as inherently superior or inferior to each other, based on presumed shared inheritable traits, abilities or qualities. So the classic thought of a racist is a sort of a Ku Klux Klan member who believes that the white people are superior inherently to black people.
Yeah, and act accordingly, of course.
So that's your classic racist.
Have you ever tested in your own mind your own sort of thoughts and behaviours towards people of difference, just to sort of, examine your own deepest, darkest thoughts about how you feel about people who are different?
Well, I don't know. Don't we do that every week here in some sense, try and examine our thoughts on
No, I'm a great
differences?
believer in regularly, examining my own assumptions about things. But anyway,
Okay, so that was the classic when you're thinking of a racist, and the nasty part about that is it's a belief that certain individuals are inherently lesser, not as smart, not as good, or whatever, simply by virtue of the race that they're in. So it's ascribing a belief to them based on their skin colour that's often detrimental. But what we're tending to find is there's characteristics are being described to people or ascribed to people based on their skin colour, which is seen as good. And it's like, well, you're that skin colour. You've got certain spiritual abilities or other things which are sort of in a good light. So, I would argue that that's a form of racism where you are not necessarily saying somebody's picked up a bad trait because of their skin colour, but you're saying they pick up a good trait because of their skin colour is also a racist thing. So I'm just going to shift this camera because I'm looking at you all the time, seeing it's just the two of us.
Right, yeah.
Let's see if,
that's a good idea.
Yeah, and then you'll look...
And maybe you can shift this one along as well.
Right. You're spot on.
Am I?
So, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm a close-up now.
Right.
But I'm looking at you, so I might as well move it there. So,
Right, sure.
Right. So, okay, back to this definition. It may include prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against other people because they are of a different race, or the belief that members of different races or ethnicities should be treated differently. So here's where we're going to come into problems, because I don't think people should be treated differently because of their race. I think they should be treated differently because of particular disadvantage that they may be suffering. Poor, unhealthy, or in a spot of bother for whatever reason, which is independent of their skin colour.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's setting out the scene of where we're heading. So bear in mind, positive racism towards one race must necessarily involve negative racism to the other races. Like if you are going to provide benefits for one race, and you're saying, well, it's positive. Well, if you're not a member of that race, it's actually negative as well. So when you're dividing up a pot and you're only giving some of the pot to some people, then you're necessarily disadvantaging the others, even though they're not having something taken off them. So keep that in mind as well. And why are we concerned about Indigenous people in the first place, Paul? And it's because we see that disproportionately members of their group suffer disadvantage and injustices. And it's the disadvantage and suffering that motivates us, and that's what we've got to keep our eye on. And we've got to acknowledge that not everybody of that skin colour suffers that disadvantage, and maybe people of other skin colours do suffer that disadvantage. So it's not the skin colour, it's the disadvantage that counts. Yep. And we'll probably be on this like a broken record, probably. So yeah, there we go. So that's that. Now, a few other ground rules before we get started. The ground rules and the lead up to this is going to take up half the episode, so we'll see how we go. But I think we're going to state a proposition and then the underlying principle which is being applied, and then we're going to apply that principle to other scenarios and check whether it seems to stack up. To give you an example, later on in this topic, we're going to talk about the fact that it seems an argument on behalf of Indigenous people is that they were here first and therefore have some special rights that others don't have. That's the sort of proposition. And then I would say, well, if you think that's correct, then how does that apply to refugees? Do we, as the people already here, have the right to say to refugees, well, we're here before you, so you can't be a full citizen, you're going to get some partial rights that we don't have. And so when you provide a principle and then you take that principle and apply it to other scenarios, suddenly it shines a light on the principle as to whether it's a good one or a bad one. You say, well, let's explore this principle. How does it stack up when you apply it with other people and other situations, and does it still look as fair? So that's how we're going to be treating some of this. The other thing that we've come across, Paul, is you see on panel discussions and other things where they say, well, as a white man, you've not experienced persecution. And without the lived experience of being an Indigenous person, you can't comment. Do you want to jump in on that one and your response to that?
I mean, I get a little bit irritated by that as well. And not that I don't think people experience things that you could characterise as racism. Obviously, some people do. And I suppose in some respects, I would have to say I've never consciously been, had a bad time, had a bad experience. Although, no, hang on. No, I lie. I did once in Indonesia. I had a rather unpleasant experience just because I was a young Western tourist, and I was a local guy in Indonesia befriended me or pretended to befriend me and sort of, beckoned me to jump on his motorbike. And he took me to a place where I didn't know where I was and basically abandoned me, But, I mean, it's sort of small change in the grand scheme of things. But, yeah, I suppose it's fair to say that it's hard for us to fully comprehend the sorts of lived experience that people who are not of European ancestry might experience in Australia. Yeah.
So I don't know what it's like to walk into a shop and have people look at you suspiciously all the time.
Exactly.
Think that you might be about to steal stuff. And
call the security to follow us around and things like that.
Yeah, and just sort of standing out in a crowd. Exactly. So I haven't experienced that. But I can imagine what it's like. And I can certainly comment on what rules and regulations we should put in place to deal with that.
And you can also empathise with a person who has experienced it.
Yes.
It's not like we are totally incapable of understanding why that's an objectionable or an unpleasant experience.
Yeah. One of the things about being human is that you are able to put yourself in the shoes of other people and see it from their perspective.
Absolutely, yeah.
Particularly if you're prepared to listen and hear what they're saying, which we are. So if your argument is, well, if you haven't lived as an Aboriginal person, an Indigenous person, you just can't talk about this topic. You have no standing. Well, we may as well stop now. And if you're of that view, then turn off. And, but if we can't have a debate, then we just can't simply say to the oppressed or disadvantaged, well, we'll all stand back and just let you deal with it and talk about it and come up with your own solutions. Like, that's not how it works. We need to put all of our heads together and try and come up with solutions. So
we are a nation after all.
And, there's lots of other groups and people. And here again, dear listener, we'll sort of take that principle. If you say, well, if you're not a member of a group, then you can't determine rules that will affect that group because you don't have their lived experience. Well, if we were to say that, Christians say that they're persecuted and discriminated against at the moment, that there's, they have a problem with freedom of religion in this country. So I don't live as a Christian and I can't speak about their human interactions and how they might, every day living as a Christian. But I can certainly speak about our rules and systems and structures and say, well, BS on that. Like you don't have a problem with freedom of religion here. I don't need to be
and it's not the same as having a different skin colour or a different sort of physical appearance difference, is it? I mean, if you're a Christian, if you don't mention it, who would know?
Yeah.
So you're not going to experience that sort of obvious discriminatory behaviour.
Yeah. So the other thing was other sort of topics that we've dealt with in the past. Look, I could say, again, I could take that argument. I could turn around and say something like, well, as a non-lawyer, you can't comment about laws.
Yes, indeed.
But of course you can.
Of course you can, yes.
You can talk about what's right and what's just. So, of course you can. As an upper middle class media celebrity Aboriginal person, you can't comment on the plight of remote Aboriginal people. I mean, I could say that.
Could, yeah.
We could break down people's identities into the smallest categories and say, well, you don't fit that box, so you can't talk about it. We could go on and on. So
it would even undermine our political system, because we could say our elected representatives can't possibly know what each of us as individuals live through.
yes. So if you believe in that argument, then you'll just be in a room of people and none of you will be able to talk, because I'll just keep breaking down your minority status groups until the point where you're no longer a member of any group. And we could do that forever. So that's not helpful. So, right, Paul, still setting this up. And let me just see, this... I just don't have the internet speed. If you're watching on the live stream, sorry, but I'm not able to get the internet speed, so we'll just see what happens.
Okay.
Terminology. When we're talking about Indigenous brothers and sisters, Paul. Aboriginal, Aborigine, First Peoples, Indigenous. Got any preferred words that you use, or what do you tend to use?
Indigenous.
So that seems to be perfectly acceptable in most situations.
Although I got pulled up for spelling it with a lowercase I once on the internet. Somebody demanded I must use the uppercase I, which I thought was pretty trivial.
Yeah. Incidentally, the other week when you were talking about that forest playground that you visited.
The Indigenous forest.
The Indigenous forest. And one of our listeners said, well, an Indigenous forest could mean that it's just got native trees that are Indigenous.
I saw the comment, but I've never heard a forest referred to as an Indigenous forest before. Have you?
It would normally be a native forest.
Native forest, exactly, which is not exactly the same thing.
So if they were wanting to say native forest, it would be unusual. Yeah. But anyway.
It seemed a very pretentious, ostentatious, if I can put it that way, an ostentatious use of the word Indigenous. It seemed to me they were trying too hard to be fashionable.
Given that the use of the word Indigenous is so much attached to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Exactly.
And the option of calling it a native forest was there. Yeah. Anyway, that's by the by. So yes, Indigenous, Aboriginal as an adjective to describe people seems to be okay. But not an Aboriginal as a noun. You might say an Aboriginal person, Aboriginal man, Aboriginal woman, but not an Aboriginal.
Or an Aborigine as a noun?
Yes, or an Aborigine without sort of attaching the Aboriginal person.
Yeah.
You're then sort of saying they're not really a person, they're something else. So,
yeah, it is interpreted that way.
So there we go. That's terminology. Let's talk a little bit about some...
Sorry, before you go on, what about the new terminology that we're expected to wear, like white fella, black fella, mob?
Well, mob refers to their mob normally, don't they?
Yeah.
You don't have a white mob; it's a black mob.
Yeah.
So that's self-descriptive.
But I've seen some other new ones, and they just don't come immediately to mind. But do you know what I mean? People shape language to suit their own particular purposes and predilections, don't they?
Yeah, I don't have a problem.
I don't have a huge problem either.
Okay.
I mean,
yep.
To me, I mean, words are useful, and I try to be precise with language as far as possible. But yeah, if they want to refer to themselves as a mob or black, I do take exception, I must say, to black fellas and white fellas, because I don't think it's useful to categorise people in such clear sort of, dichotomous categories. Do you? Do you have a problem with it?
No.
You don't really? Yeah, I find it irritating.
No, I'm okay with that. How many Indigenous people in Australia, Paul?
How many are there?
Yes, according to the latest census, there was 649,171 who identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. Now, the interesting thing is the majority of those people, 81%, live in non-remote areas of Australia.
Oh, really? 81%? That's
81%.
surprising, isn't it?
So I'm going to bring up on the screen, it's probably Probably nobody watching because of our difficulties. But actually, let me just bring that out even. Let me see. I brought up a map of Australia on the screen, and if you get a chance to look at this at some stage, dear listener, it's got most of Australia, like obviously the desert remote areas is in a light yellow, and then there's a light green, and then progressively darker green sort of categories. So the yellow and the very light green are the very remote and remote. But as we said, 81% of Indigenous
I'm
people
surprised, I have to say.
live in this sort of non-remote area, and that's really Tasmanian East Coast. In Western Australia, this sort of non-remote area would be around Perth and Margaret River. And then on the East Coast, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, up to Brisbane, areas that are about 3 to 4 hours drive from the coast. So 81% of Indigenous people live about 3 to 4 hours drive from the coast.
Interesting.
Is how it pans out. So it is a lot, yeah.
So is it just a case that we most often hear about Indigenous people in more remote or country areas?
I don't know. It's just a perception that we've got, isn't it? That when we
Seems
think,
to be a perception that I certainly had.
yeah. So, so in the show notes, have a look at the links, and you'll see the picture that I'm referring to. Now, in the most recent census, there's been a major increase in the number of people.
And that was a fairly
Identifying.
recent
Yeah.
and quite surprising increase, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yep. So from 2011 to 2016, there was an 18.4% increase in people who identify as Indigenous. The previous 6-year gap, 5-year gap, it was 20.5% increase. So the census people are saying that there's a significant number of people identifying, and the increase is happening. I'm just going to swap this screen back. The increase, Paul, is happening in those non-remote areas, in areas like New South Wales, major cities in the east coast of Australia. So the growth primarily in numbers is major cities on the east coast of Australia, 22.8%, and the remote areas only 2%. So big increase in numbers of people in non-remote areas. What they're also finding is that, let me just see here if I've got the actual cities. So this proportion varied by jurisdiction, with the proportions higher than the national rate observed in New South Wales, Tasmania and Victoria. And this is a problem because the government funds the states according to the census outcome. So extra money is paid to traditionally the Northern Territory because the money is meant to be spent on Indigenous people. Fair enough, I say.
Sure.
Good idea. And what's happening, though, is that because the census is revealing larger numbers, increasingly larger numbers of Indigenous people in these metropolitan areas, the Northern Territory is getting less and less share of the pool of funds that they would otherwise have got. And clearly the idea of these extra payments are to help disadvantaged, suffering people, not well-to-do
To provide services.
Indigenous people. Exactly. So Aboriginal lawyer Michael Mansell said Commonwealth funds were not being distributed properly. The Yothu Yindi Foundation proposes that the definition of Aboriginality be changed so
Seriously?
that increasing numbers of people from the south of the nation identifying as Aboriginal do not tip the scales against disadvantaged Indigenous people in remote parts of the Northern Territory.
And did they outline their criteria?
No, not in what I saw here. So, Michael Mansell said it should be based on need rather than somebody declaring, I am an Aboriginal.
That's interesting, isn't
which
it?
is kind of the theme of what we're going to be saying here.
Indeed.
Yeah. So there's a quote here. So if somebody merely claims to be of a particular identity, then the Indigenous Affairs budget is divided up amongst the statistics of the census, which doesn't give those most in need the greatest access to the resources. He said here, I think the people who are ticking the box in the census have been given information that's very doubtful as to its authenticity, and people don't know that, and they just tick it thinking, well, I've been told this, so I better tick it. Meaning, I've been told I'm Aboriginal, so I better tick it. So there we go. That's interesting that because of that sort of problem, Indigenous leaders and communities are saying we need to change the definition of Aboriginal because it's not giving a fair result. It's not helping the disadvantaged. There's a good reason to change something.
And yet, you know, we were under the impression, I think I can say that if you self-identified and then you had corroborating, you know, testimony from people who were, you know, already recognised as Indigenous people, if they said that, yeah, you're Indigenous, then that was good enough.
There was kind of a three-part, now I don't have this in the notes, but we'd previously looked at, I think, a three-part thing where you had to identify as Aboriginal, you had to have membership of a clan or tribe accepted, and you had to have some sort of like DNA ancestry happening as well.
But not a DNA test.
No, but that was the sort of the three tests to be Indigenous. So, yes. So let's look at disadvantage. How bad is it out there? Life expectancy for Indigenous Australians is 10 years less than for the non-Indigenous population. The unemployment rate is nearly 4 times higher. The child mortality rate more than twice so. Indigenous Australians are incarcerated at a higher rate than any other group on earth, making up 3% of the Australian population, but 27% of adult prisoners. So clearly there is a problem.
Indeed.
And I've got some health statistics here from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Let's see what they say. There has been improvement in certain factors in recent years, but it's sort of just marginal.
Like
not
high school graduation?
No, this is about health. So,
I see.
For example, in male life expectancy, non-Indigenous males previously were likely to live 11.4 years less, and now it's 10.6 years less. So they're getting closer to the non-Indigenous life expectancy, but they're still a long way off.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Same for females, similar sorts of things. And child mortality rates are improving, but they're still way above non-Indigenous. Yeah. Things like smoking. Smoking rates amongst Indigenous Australians have declined from 51% to 42%. Things like that. But they're still way more likely to smoke, 2.7 times more likely. 2.9 times more likely to have long-term ear and hearing problems. 2.7 times more likely to have high levels of stress. All sorts of terrible statistics. Interestingly, what has contributed to the health gap? And basically there are 3 factors. So there's social determinants. So Indigenous Australians on average have lower levels of education, employment, income and poorer quality housing than non-Indigenous Australians. So that seems to be worth about 34% of the problem. Social determinants. Indigenous Australians on average have lower levels of I've done that one. Sorry, health risk factors. So Indigenous Australians on average higher rates of smoking, risky alcohol consumption, exercise less. So those sort of health risk factors seem to account for another 19%. But there's about 47% that's kind of unexplained. So, and they obviously do studies where they've looked at people of similar incomes and compared to Indigenous people of similar incomes and found these gaps and worked it out that way. Yeah. So there we go. That's the sort of state of play in a nutshell without spending too much time on it. there's a problem. What should we be doing? How we should be thinking about it, Paul? And I like to kick off just briefly, and we're going to come back to this later. Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. So, Martin Luther King, excuse me. By the way, the beer is from our beer sponsor tonight. Myself, because Scott's not here and he didn't bring any of the beer, so Mountain Goat put me down, Scott, as a beer sponsor for the
Thank you,
podcast.
Iron Fist, for the beer.
Yeah.
What are we drinking?
Mountain Goat.
Mountain Goat,
yeah, it's good. Mountain Goat, fancy pants. Yeah. So there you go.
I can't get it out of the cooler, so
good.
I won't look.
Yeah. Right. Martin Luther King famously said words along the lines of, ask not the colour of the skin, but what's the content of the character. So he was a universalist. He wanted all people to be uplifted. Malcolm X was more of, black people, you've got to band together as a group and fight for your rights as black people. Don't worry about the white working class or the other disadvantaged groups. You've got to carve out your own territory and your own identity and your own problem and fix that. So two different approaches to the problem, and so I prefer the Martin Luther King one.
Oh, absolutely. I think I would have liked to have thought that most liberal humanists would have certainly 20 or 30 years ago been inclined to be universalists, wouldn't they? They seem, I mean, a lot of leftists seem to be going down the identity politics path, and that's clearly not universalist.
Yeah, I can understand it. I can understand how people would have banded together
Out
in the
of
Malcolm X
frustration, out of
fashion,
despair.
exactly,
Yeah.
and said, "Well, let's just organise as a group and let's do our thing as a group and not worry about the rest."
Circle the wagons, keep the Indians out, so to speak.
Ultimately, though, I don't think it's the best choice, and I think
don't
that's what people are doing. So anyway, why are we talking about this now at the moment? Because we've got the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which has been in the news, and it's really talking about a voice for Indigenous people to be given to the Parliament of Australia. And it was, look, the wording of the document is a little vague in places, but essentially Barnaby Joyce and others were accused of describing it unfairly as a third chamber of Parliament. So,
Malcolm Turnbull famously made that statement.
Yeah. So it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but Indigenous people are looking for a special voice in Parliament where they are there and talking to the decision makers about their opinion on proposed laws that would affect Indigenous people, and that they be consulted with, and ultimately, though, they may not be, they don't have an actual power to veto law or to put law in place, but they have a right to be heard and listened to in Parliament. And it seems also that the membership of this advisory body would be just Indigenous people, which I don't see emphasised much anywhere, but that seems to be the case from other readings I'd had. So.
And in fact, I read one article which was written by a constitutional expert.
Yes, and Twomey, I believe.
The same one.
Yes.
And she said, well, look, it's not that unusual to have an advisory body advising the Parliament. And she cited things like, there were a number of them. But
I'm going to go through them.
Yes. But, I would make the point that none of them were based on a person's race or ethnic identity. In other words, you didn't have to belong to a particular subgroup of Australian society to get yourself onto one of those bodies.
Yeah. So we've been accused on this podcast of talking about Indigenous matters but never having any Indigenous people here to argue with us. And that's true, but it's not easy to get people on to this podcast.
You have tried, haven't you?
We have tried at different times. And also, I haven't in recent times because I wanted to put out, I wanted it to be a very deep and constructive sort of discussion. And I wanted to give fair warning to somebody about these are the ideas and topics that we're thinking of. So this is what we want you to address, and don't bother coming on unless you want to deal with these things. I mean, you can come up with other things as well that we haven't thought about. Great, no problem. But these are essential queries that you need to have thought about if you want to talk to us. Because ultimately, if this is going to go to some referendum or something, then we're the sort of people who have got to be convinced it's a good idea. So let me just change a window here so I can see if... bear with me 1 second. I'll just muck around with this. Right, that's okay. I think the stream was really bad, and now it's only sometimes bad, but who knows? We'll see. Okay, so Anne Twomey, I think, Twomey. So she is a constitutional professor of constitutional law, University of Sydney Law School. So she wrote an article about all this. So I think it's fair enough that we sort of look at her article and deal with
I read
the
it myself.
arguments that she's come up with. So here she goes, quoting her at different times. In rejecting this proposal, one claim made by the government was that this would be discriminatory and contrary to principles of equality because it would give one racial group a means of influencing Parliament that is not open to others. She goes on, but it must be remembered that it is already the case that Indigenous Australians form the only racial groups about which laws are made. This is because they are the only racial groups that lived in Australia prior to European settlement and accordingly have continuing legal rights such as native title rights. So I would say in response to that, just because there are already special racial laws is not a good reason why there should be more.
No, and I would argue that we should remove the special racial laws from the Constitution.
Indeed.
And make our Constitution completely free of any references to race.
Yeah. And when you say that they are the only racial group subject to a law, there's a problem with that because you don't have to name a group to make legislation relevant to them. If you make a law granting a privilege to Indigenous people, you're effectively making a law saying everyone has this privilege except non-Indigenous people. Like when you give a right to somebody which you don't give to others, you're making laws in respect of the others as well.
Absolutely.
So it's just wrong to say that they're the only racial group about whom laws are made. When laws are made, they are made and affect all of us, whether we're part of the group or not, because we either get the privilege or the suffering or we don't. And that makes a difference. She goes on. Their continuing cultural heritage is also entitled to special legal protection and sustenance as part of Australia's national heritage. So, the continuing cultural heritage is also entitled to special legal protection and sustenance. I would say cultural artefacts are worthy of protection. But this reference to continuing cultural heritage seems to be a reference to cultural norms and practices and seems to possibly assume that these are somehow sacred and should not evolve over time. These cultural norms and practices, I say, are ideological choices, the same as mine, nothing special. The artefacts are special.
Absolutely, and I think...
And deserve protection.
Absolutely,
But the actual ideology and ideas of a culture are not sacred. They're meant to change and evolve over time. And, locking in these things because you think the old way is the best way and must be preserved could be doing somebody a real disservice.
Not only that, but I'm sure we can think of several examples where that would be totally inappropriate. I mean, if people migrating to our country from very different cultural traditions insisted that their, cultural heritage should be entitled to special legal protection and sustenance.
Why not?
Why not?
If one group is entitled,
Exactly.
I mean, again, it's just because we're going to deal with this whole thing of just because you're here first. Should that make a difference?
And there's another case is with the Catholic Church. claiming that confession was sacrosanct.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a special cultural tradition for the Catholic Church. And recently the law, I believe, has said, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't deserve special protection just because it's part of your cultural tradition.
Yeah, I think maybe Victoria has brought that in, but I'm not sure. Right. So back to this constitutional lawyer, professor. Excuse me. She says, if established, the body representing Indigenous voices would have its views tabled in the Parliament so the Parliament could be better informed when it makes laws. It would not be the only body to inform Parliament. There are numerous other bodies that already fulfil this function, representing other points of view. They include the Productivity Commission, the Australian Law Reform Commission, the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Auditor General. They all make reports directly to Parliament which are tabled so that our lawmakers can be better informed when they enact laws. Well, the answer is why not do the same? And none of those would have a racist employment policy. Presumably, they employ the best people possible to advise on those areas.
Yeah, what happened to the Racial Discrimination Act? Does it not apply to that particular body?
It won't do if it's a new
not.
body. Yeah. Right, going back to the professor, she says, is any of these bodies a third House of Parliament? Obviously not. Of course not. None of them has the power to initiate a bill in the Parliament. They can neither vote on the passage of legislation nor veto it. None is a constituent part of the body that makes laws. It would be exactly the same for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. It could not be a third House of Parliament simply because it would have no power to initiate, pass or reject bills. Its role would be to give voice to Indigenous views so they could be heard within the Parliament. Again, so set up an Indigenous Commission the same way, I say. She says, if we are comfortable with the Auditor General reporting to Parliament and advising about issues of financial prudence and accountability, then it's difficult to see how we would not be comfortable with an Indigenous body informing Parliament about matters that could improve the effectiveness and utility of its laws in Indigenous affairs and the efficient targeting of its expenditure. And I again would say, well, set it up like you would the Auditor General. She says, Houses of Parliament are not obliged to implement the advice of the Auditor General, but will give it respect if it is sensible, well-reasoned and wise. The same would no doubt be true of any advice or recommendation of the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It's hard to imagine why anyone would argue that it is better for Parliament to be ignorant and ill-informed, its laws ineffective and its expenditure wasteful. I think we've answered that. Just do the same as the Auditor General. She herself says, why do we need a constitutional amendment to give effect to this proposal when other bodies already fulfil a similar role under ordinary legislation? She says an important aspect of the proposal is the moral authority of the people. If, as in 1967, the vast swath of Australian people voted in favour of Indigenous Australians having a voice about laws, it would not only provide a profound reconciliatory moment, I would say a possibly profoundly divisive and racist moment.
I agree.
In Australian political history, but here's the thing, it would also impose a sufficient political pressure to prevent future backsliding. Governments would be forced to make the new system work and focus upon how to get the best out of it. It could not be abandoned by neglect. So the argument is, if it's a part of the Constitution, it can't disappear, whereas a Productivity Commission or an Auditor General could potentially disappear.
Or an ATSIC.
Yeah. But my point is, if it's merely advisory and the only thing stopping a then government from disbanding it is its constitutional authority, then you can be sure that such a government would ignore the advisory body. Like having it in the Constitution isn't going to solve that problem. If they hate it so much that they want to get rid of it, damn, we can't because it's in the Constitution, they're just not going to listen to it.
Or just, make tokenistic sort of measures to make it appear as if they're doing something.
And she sort of finishes off by saying it looks like the government might be coming around on this issue, and I think you're right. And I think the government might be coming around, it seems.
They look like they are, yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly when people like Barnaby Joyce are coming out and saying, oh, maybe I was wrong.
So that's dealing with that. Now we're going to get into more sort of hodgepodge of topics related to this. And the justification, the moral authority for a lot of this, it seems to be modern Indigenous people seem to be claiming to have inherited rights from their ancestors.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's an implied allegation that white people have inherited the guilt of their ancestors. Seem to be all part of this.
Seems to be.
Because it's an intergenerational thing that we're talking about.
Indeed.
Can't be any getting around that.
No.
So first up, as we've said before, isn't an Indigenous person of mixed race, in effect, complaining of injustices committed by one set of their ancestors against another set of their ancestors?
They seem to be.
I mean, it's okay if people want to make a choice and identify with one part of their ancestry and ignore the other. Go ahead. But
Sure.
making laws, that was a different matter. What you want to do in your private life, go ahead.
Yeah, like some people say, I'm Irish Australian or Italian Australian or Greek Australian or whatever, Chinese Australian. Why not, if that makes you feel good about yourself?
Yeah.
But why should the rest of the population wear that?
Yeah, and it's a different matter if you're claiming rights then as a matter of inheritance. Then we're able to say, okay, well, what about the other ancestry? How's that work? Explain that. And just because you choose one rather than the other doesn't really stack up to me. So, this sort of inherited guilt sounds a lot like original sin. And in this podcast, we spend a lot of time bagging religion and the concept of original sin. So it's got a close association with it, it seems.
Indeed.
Yeah. One thing I would say is my father was in the Second World War, spent time in Changi Prison, Burma Railway. Did he wipe his guilt out by any chance? By defending the sort of freedom of this country, are you able to clear off some guilt in some way? Is that possible? Is there a way of removing the guilt through an act like that?
I don't know. What do you think?
What do Aboriginal... tell me, Indigenous people out there, is it worth anything in this cause? And, for that matter, did I inherit his clean soul?
So if you can inherit guilt, why can't you inherit... what's the opposite of guilt in the church?
Innocence.
No, I mean after your soul has been cleansed. Absolution.
Right.
Can you inherit
yes.
absolution?
Yes. Have I inherited absolution? Have I? I really...
Do you feel absolved?
I don't want to inherit it. I don't believe in that sort of inheritance.
Of course not.
Yeah. What about convicts who are sent here against their will?
Indeed.
They didn't want to be here.
No.
Do they absorb the guilt? I mean, people were just lobbed here through no fault of their own. The other thing that people should be aware of, just as a little aside, which I found was interesting, is that DNA is not a liquid that can be divided down into microscopic drops. So the geneticist Graham Coop of the University of California, Davis, and his colleagues have just studied how DNA disappears. If you pick one of your ancestors from 10 generations back, the odds are around 50% that you carry any DNA from him or her, and the odds get even worse beyond that.
How many generations?
10 generations, and it's roughly 10 generations
so that's roughly 200
from the
years.
first fleet.
Yeah.
So it disappears over time, quite possibly. You could have on your record ironclad proof that you had Indigenous blood in you from 250 years ago, and it could all be gone and not a skerrick of it there. So bear that in mind as just an interesting aside. This is the ridiculousness.
It's quite interesting, yeah.
This is the ridiculousness of basing things on DNA.
As you know, Trevor, I don't believe that we should be talking about races at all. We're the human race, for goodness sake, and our superficial exterior differences are just, according to science, are just relatively recent environmental adaptations. And I read in one place, even white Europeans may not have been white Europeans even as recently as 20 or 25,000 years ago. That they probably had dark skin, all of them.
Probably, yeah. I mean, this is about when Well, when you see the images of Jesus on the cross, he's invariably very white Caucasian.
that's all
and, you know,
fantasy
and
anyway,
clearly, he
isn't
would
it?
have been a black man of some description.
Well, if he ever existed, of course.
Indeed, yeah. Let's. That's another topic for another day. Yep. So, so just applying some of these ideas, because here's what I said earlier in the podcast, dear listener, is, you know, what's the principle at play? Now, how does that play out in other scenarios? Does it still seem fair? So, it could be that my descendants would have more rights than me. So, to my knowledge, I have no Indigenous ancestry, so I couldn't participate in the special advisory body. Mm-hmm. If, however, my children marry an Indigenous person, then my grandchildren could, in theory, identify as Indigenous and participate. My grandchildren could have more rights than me due to racial profiling.
Yes, indeed.
Doesn't that seem unfair? Isn't that racist?
Sounds it.
Go back to our definition of racism in the beginning.
Indeed.
Yeah. Right. One of the concepts at play here is we got here first. So, in effect, the special rights to be granted to Indigenous people are a recognition that their ancestors were here first, that they owned it and it was taken from them against their will. In effect, non-Indigenous people at a legal level are second-class citizens in comparison.
According to that schema.
Yep.
And as you said, and do we then rank people according to how long their ancestors have been here?
Yeah. Dear listener, if you've just tuned in and you missed the first part, go back to the beginning, because we acknowledged the disadvantage and suffering of Indigenous people, but not all of them. A lot of them, a disproportionate amount, yes, but not all of them. In effect, non-Indigenous people at a legal level are second-class citizens. That wouldn't look good if we applied the same thinking to refugees arriving by boat. Imagine if we said, okay, you can come in, but we don't like it. And your ancestors will be ineligible for certain advisory bodies until they intermarry with the people who got here first.
Yes, indeed.
What would the left say to that? They'd say, how disgusting. Yeah. What is the Indigenous position on refugees? I would like to know. Because you see, it's about victim status, because obviously refugees we have sympathy for because they've had a hard time and we would not want to increase their hardship in a nasty way. And so sympathies and emotions are at play, where you then go, oh, well, that's not really fair.
And like me, I'm sure you've seen self-identified Indigenous spokespeople or commentators expressing great sympathy for refugees on Nauru and Manus Island. And, you know, and that's a reasonable position for anyone to hold. Yeah. But, you know, according to your proposition, they would have fewer rights, wouldn't they?
Victims are not necessarily expert on providing their own solutions. So what evidence is there that Indigenous rather than non-Indigenous people know what is best for Indigenous people?
And that's partly, I mean, that's foundational to their claim, isn't it, for wanting an Indigenous voice, is that non-Indigenous people are just not qualified to fix their problems.
Because they haven't had the lived experience. Yeah. So I would say lots of Indigenous leaders have been very poor. So somebody like Anthony Mundine advised against vaccinations, for goodness sake. Many Indigenous leaders were against marriage equality.
Were they?
Ken Wyatt is part of a government that through reckless tax cuts has sabotaged the welfare system that many Indigenous people rely on and are going to rely on.
And probably for several...
So Ken Wyatt, the Indigenous Affairs Minister, or however it's phrased, has done more damage for needy Indigenous people than anybody else in the last little while,
just
simply
by helping that government get
to
re-elected.
those tax cuts.
Yes, and supporting it.
So, you know, these Indigenous leaders are not necessarily any better. And if I have Indigenous grandchildren, I can give better advice than those numbskulls about how best to care for my Indigenous grandchildren.
Not a very nice thing to say about your grandchildren.
No, oh, sorry. Well, numbskulls as in Anthony Mundine, Ken Wyatt, people like that. So I could give better advice than them about what to do for potentially my Indigenous grandchild and great-grandchildren, but I'd be banned from doing so because of my skin colour.
Yeah.
These are interesting arguments when you
pull it apart, you can see the bankruptcy of that whole theory.
Yeah. How can we say there is an Indigenous position on anything? So I said earlier, what's the Indigenous position on refugees? Presumably, they don't all think the same. Are they, like many Australians, split 50-50 on important issues? So this is it's a racist thinking to say, well, all Indigenous people think this particular way or that particular way.
That's right, or all non-Indigenous
because you're assuming
people.
Because of their skin colour they have a certain characteristic.
That's right.
That is racism. You have to accept that there's a high likelihood that Indigenous people have got to have a spectrum of views on issues as much as white people
Wouldn't
do.
you think?
Indeed. I mean, white people are arguing about what's the best thing to do for white people, and we're stuck 50-50 on Liberal and Labor most of the time, and our thoughts on how the best to deal with it are at polar, we're getting more and more apart. It's racist to say that Aboriginal people would all think the same on an issue.
Yeah.
It would be impossible for an advisory board to give full and frank advice as to a dominating majority opinion of what Indigenous people think about it. Or not impossible, but difficult, fraught with danger, and just because it is the majority view, maybe it's wrong. So, I mean, the majority voted for Scott Morrison in the last election, and I'm saying they're wrong. That was a big mistake. So,
it was a small majority, but it was a majority.
I mentioned earlier that Indigenous people, there was a number of leaders were against marriage equality. I've got a link here. There was a bark petition, about 25 different tribes who signed it and saying that they were against marriage equality and it was against opposed to it and called for the sanctity of traditional marriage. So
it's interesting.
Even on an issue like that, there's a hugely divergent opinion.
I have no idea what the traditional Indigenous attitude to homosexuality is. Do you have any idea?
There wouldn't be one.
But have you ever seen the TV program Black Comedy? Is it Black Comedy?
I've seen bits of it.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the recurring skits that they had on that program was some, obviously gay Aboriginal men, acting very obviously like, homosexuals.
Sort of bit camp.
Yeah, very camp.
Right.
Yeah. And presumably it was supposed to be funny because we don't expect to see obviously camp Aboriginal men. Is that what it was about?
Could be. I didn't see it, but yeah. Is Indigenous decision making by its leadership democratic, and does it matter? So Jacinta Napi-Jimpa Price said that going back to 2017, when First Nations Constitutional Convention was held at Uluru, the representatives in attendance were invited by nominees of the Referendum Council and not elected by Indigenous people.
Not elected?
No. So do we value democracy for Indigenous
people or not? Do you know if Ms Price was there?
Not sure.
I'm not sure either.
Don't know. Class divisions in Indigenous communities. Is there a division between working class and privileged Indigenous people? What was the Indigenous position on the recent tax cuts? I didn't hear a thing. As we've said, this is probably one of the biggest decisions affecting Indigenous people, but I didn't hear a peep. So we never hear of working class Indigenous people, upper class Indigenous people, but they must exist. They're all lumped together as Indigenous.
Yeah.
And they would have different priorities and interests. And
although, of course, there are working class Indigenous people. And
of course.
Stan Grant is one that comes to mind who speaks about his childhood and his upbringing. And, it's pretty clear his family were working class Indigenous people.
Very much. Yeah, of course there is.
Yeah.
Just getting back to the inherited rights, are inherited privileges fair? So the left often advocates for inheritance tax.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And in doing so recognises that there are good reasons why wealth and entitlement should not be passed down in full to descendants
And there's a pretty strong argument for that, I think.
Shouldn't the same apply to land rights?
Interesting.
If you're a lefty in favour of inheritance tax, it's difficult to hold those two positions.
But they're special. They're First Nations.
I think we should be a republic. I think the notion of inherited rights belonging to the royal family is unjust. I don't believe privilege should be passed on down generations to a special family based on their DNA.
Agree.
So, again, if you're a Republican, an anti-monarchist, because you don't like the idea of the inherited privilege of the royal family,
Then why
then
not?
are you against all inherited
Exactly,
privilege?
across the board. It's a very good question.
We say that welfare should be based on need, not race. So I'd have no problem tripling the welfare payments to disadvantaged Indigenous people
Or
and non-Indigenous
non-Indigenous
people
Indeed.
in remote communities. But a wealthy Indigenous city dweller should get no special treatment.
Which brings to mind, Trevor, when was the last time you filled in a Commonwealth document?
The one with the little box?
The one with a little box that asks you to tick whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous.
Yeah.
Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, yes or no?
That box should say, are you disadvantaged and poor? Are you on New Start? Are you on some welfare benefit? Do
what it
you
should
earn
ask.
less than
Exactly.
$50,000 a year? That should
Exactly.
be the box that you're ticking.
It's a
not
racist inclusion on all those documents, isn't it?
Yeah. Gee, we're going to get in trouble for this. Like, people are not going to cop this.
Do you know, I was thinking about that recently, and I was thinking, I always, dutifully tick the non-Indigenous box. I think I'm just going to ignore it from now on.
Right.
I'm just not going to tick anything
Yeah. Yep.
that relates to race.
Yeah. So we say possibly, that identity politics is a scourge on our society.
Sure is.
Disadvantaged people should be coalescing together rather than splintering into identity groups. Stan Grant was in the news a year and a half, 2 years ago, sort of wrote a letter, and one of the quotes he said in it was, "For so many of my people, Aboriginal people, there is a deep, deep wound that comes from the time of dispossession." And I've got a link to an interesting letter by a refugee who responds to the Stan Grant letter. And he just says, "Stan, that's a tribalistic sentiment that's unhelpful and fuels resentment. It doesn't lead to change." Also in the Stan Grant speech, he says, "Someone's suffering was the scaffolding on which you built your prosperity." And what I would say to that is, in terms of, say, Latin America, with the Spanish invasion, they basically put all of the natives to work in the mines, extracted all the gold and silver and shipped it back to Spain and depleted those countries of reserves which today would be in the trillions of dollars and could be setting up those countries. And that was wealth that was extracted and sent offshore. Here in Australia, we're more fortunate because the sort of minerals and wealth of this country weren't, to a similar extent, extracted and shipped off to another country, essentially, ignoring, of course, multinationals rorting the system and all the rest of it. But comparatively to a large extent, our wealth has stayed in this country and been spent on this country and is here for everybody. You're not excluded from it.
So mining of minerals in Australia didn't really reach an intensive stage until probably around the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Would that be right?
There were gold rushes and things, of course.
There were,
but
yes, in the 19th century.
Yeah.
But, when did the sort of mass exploitation of things like iron ore start? I think it was sort of...
That was Lang Hancock flying his plane over Western Australia and spotting iron ore from the...
They were shipping it out before that. I think probably, roughly the middle of the... I mean, there was that thing prior to World War II where... Bob Menzies, ex-Prime Minister Bob Menzies was labelled Pig Iron Bob for shipping iron to the Japanese.
Right, yeah. So just in more recent times. And yes, multinationals have taken some of that wealth and shipped it offshore, but to a large extent, much of the wealth stayed in the country, and it's there for all Australians, hopefully, to benefit from. But anyway, that's that argument. Right, one of our favourite writers over the years has been Kenan Malik.
Indeed.
So he talks about class, working class, and the plight of the working class people. And he talks about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And Kenan is such a marvellous writer that I'm just going to read some of his stuff. So here we go. Martin Luther King's insistence on non-violence is well known, but his radicalism is often forgotten. In the mid-1960s, he took a decisive and politically brave stance against the Vietnam War, describing America as the great purveyor of violence in the world today. He became an advocate, too, of working-class struggles. In the weeks before his death, King was deeply involved in the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, when rubbish collectors had taken industrial action for union recognition, better conditions and equal pay. To question poverty, he observed, is to question the capitalistic economy. So that's the sort of universalism that King was interested in. Malcolm X reinvented himself to an even greater degree. A petty criminal in his youth, it was in prison that he discovered the Nation of Islam and became a Muslim. By the 1950s, he'd become an effective public advocate, a searing voice against racism. He eventually broke away from an organisation in 1964. Sorry about this. He is quoted as saying, "There will ultimately be a clash between the oppressed and those that do the oppressing. But I don't think it will be based on the colour of the skin."
Oh, really?
That was Malcolm X.
Wow.
So even he had that sort of view. So bear that in mind, Indigenous leaders. It's about class and poverty and gathering together everybody.
Your access to the nation's resources.
Yeah. By the end of their lives, the two men had drawn closer to each other's views. Their differences were, however, real and spoke to an inherent tension within the struggle for racial equality. King expressed a universalist ethos that racism was intimately bound with the social structures of America and that challenging it required the creation of broader social movements. Malcolm X was sceptical both about the possibilities of such movements and about King's call for moderation to win wider support. He insisted that blacks had first to organise on their own and to protect themselves by any means necessary. It was a vision that inspired the radicalism of the Black Panthers and the Black Panther Power movement. So there's a choice there. Indigenous leaders. I say go with the Martin Luther King version. You'll get more assistance if you do. Right. I'll move on from that. Okay. Now we're going to move on to a guy called Coleman Hughes. And I've only discovered this guy about a year ago. And
He's terrific.
Fascinating.
He's terrific. And he's so young. He's only like 22 or something.
He's an undergraduate.
He's an undergraduate in philosophy, I think, at a university in New York.
Yeah. So he, of course, is talking about America, United States. And he is a black man of African-American descent, I believe. And he's talking about the wealth gap between African-American blacks and the white population and talking about how it's come about, that wealth gap. Is it because of discrimination or are there other factors at play? And he's able to illustrate in this article, and I'm just sort of querying how much of it to tell. Basically, that there's an argument that even though laws are fair now, that black people were disadvantaged for so long, kept out of the property market, that they can never get back onto it. and are therefore permanently disadvantaged
That they can never
in
catch
terms
up.
of wealth,
Yeah.
which sounds a reasonable hypothesis. But he draws comparisons with other migrant groups who have had no benefits of any special sort, and perhaps even more discrimination. So he says history tells a different story, starting with the California Alien Land Law of 1913. 14 states passed laws preventing Japanese American peasant farmers from owning land and property. These laws existed until 1952, when the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional. Add to that the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, and it's fair to say that they were given no bootstraps in America. Nevertheless, by 1970, census data showed Japanese Americans out-earning Anglo-Americans, Irish Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans and Polish Americans. Again, for Asian Americans on the whole, an analysis of wealth data from 1989 to 2013 predicted that their median wealth will soon surpass the white median level. So that's for Asians as a race, Asian Americans. If wealth differences were largely explained by America's history of favouring certain groups over others, then it would be hard to explain why Asian Americans, who were never favoured, are on track to become wealthier than whites. And the argument that he puts forward, dear listener, is that culture is important.
Indeed.
That certain races, ethnicities, cultures all come with a culture. And those cultures, we praise them in certain ways. Oh, isn't this culture magnificent? Those Italians know how to cook pasta, or
Indeed.
whatever it is about culture that you want to, the spirituality of Indigenous people or whatever. People always speak glowingly and positive about aspects of culture, but Colin Hughes makes the point that some cultures come with negative sides as well, and sometimes those negative sides are in the wealth creation.
And he also
areas.
mentions Haitian immigrants to the United States who were basically of African descent. And yet within a relatively short period of time, their average wealth exceeded that of the African Americans who'd been there for many generations.
Yeah. So you might say about the Asian situation, well, they don't look black, and black people look black and are discriminated in a certain way because of their look. And that would be a good argument.
But the same applies to the Haitians.
Exactly. So he says, a 2015 study of wealth in Boston found that the median black household, so this is black African American, had only $8 of wealth. But the $8 figure only pertained to black Bostonians of American ancestry. Black Bostonians of Caribbean ancestry had $12,000 of wealth, despite having identical rates of college graduation, only slightly higher incomes, and being equally black in the same city. So Caribbean blacks and American blacks, same city, same slightly higher income, but same rates of college graduation.
Physically indistinguishable
Indeed,
to the average person.
in the same city. And he says similar disparities emerge when people are grouped by religion. A 2003 study found that Jewish households had a 7-to-1 wealth advantage over conservative Protestant households, despite the fact that Protestants have been favoured over Jews for most of American history.
And they also carry that mythical, Protestant work ethic.
Yes. So what happens, of course, is in certain communities, the black African community, there's, first of all, amongst males, a propensity not to value academic study because you're seen as being a whitey. There's also issues to do with spending of money, which I'll get onto. Whereas in the Caribbean black community, education was valued. So, big differences there.
Also, in Asian communities, education is very highly valued.
Exactly. And we know, that, in Indian and Asian communities, value medicine, for example, you just find a disproportionate number of people of those races, ethnicities, if you like, in those professions because of culture. So where was I going to end? And just with Jewish people, like I spend a fair bit of time with some Jewish people, and I can tell you, those people talk business all the time.
Do they?
And they get together, and it's about business.
And it's cultural.
And that's a cultural thing. And, kids who grow up in a Jewish household hear about how their parents and their parents' friends and their community make money in business.
Yeah.
And when you sit and absorb it, you learn that stuff. Indeed. And you have... wealth creation sense, of how to run a business sense, you're ahead of the game.
Indeed.
Yeah. Right. So let me just see here. So Coleman Hughes says that conspicuous amongst the sort of progressive left is whether people can help themselves. And there's a little bit of that in the Indigenous community amongst some people. Jacinta Nampijimpa Price would be one who'd say, I think people can help themselves a bit more.
Saying, that they have to, rather than just incessantly complaining, they have to get off their asses and do something constructive.
So on the American side, Coleman Hughes talks about what black African Americans can do to help themselves as a group. And he said, no element of culture harms black wealth accrual more directly than spending patterns. Nielsen, one of the world's leading market research firms, keeps extensive data on American consumer behaviour, broken down demographically. A 2017 report found compared to white women, black women were 14% more likely to own a luxury vehicle, 16% more likely to purchase costume jewellery, and 9% more likely to purchase fine jewellery. A similar Nielsen report from 2013 found that only 62% of Americans own a smartphone, but 71% of blacks owned one.
Only 62%?
That was in 2013.
Oh, right.
Owned a smartphone.
It's probably higher now.
Moreover, all of these spending differences were unconditional on wealth and income.
So it's a cultural thing rather than something determined by their, wealth.
Yeah. Talks about a study consistent with the Nielsen data. They found that blacks with comparable incomes to whites spent 17% less on education and 32% more on visible goods such as cars, jewellery and clothes. And that's accounted for about 50% of the sort of the wealth disparity. So these are things in black American culture that seem to make sense to me. And bringing that back to our Australian Indigenous culture, I don't see the same bling culture. But certainly you have this idea in the remote communities about, what you own belongs to the tribe.
Yeah, humbug is what they call it.
Yeah. And that's a cultural thing.
Very much so.
In those communities, which necessarily would suck the life force out of any person thinking of acquiring wealth, because why work hard when you're just going to be giving it all away? I mean, surely that's a cultural reason in some places. Not all, but surely that is a factor that comes to play in disadvantage.
It would appear to be a fairly, I may be wrong, but a fairly consistent pattern throughout Indigenous societies.
Let me just see here. He says here, Coleman Hughes again, just to sort of finish up, just like no person is born knowing how to brew beer or play basketball, no person is born knowing how to build wealth. These skills must be taught. And just like some cultures teach beer brewing or basketball playing better than others, some cultures teach wealth building better. Children from one culture may routinely hear phrases like asset diversification and mutual fund and employment rate on the lips of their parents, whereas children from another culture may not hear such phrases until adulthood, if they ever hear them at all. So, good points.
I never heard those words in my childhood, I have to say.
Yeah. So, still on Coleman Hughes, and he has the parable of the pedestrian. which comes from a legal scholar, Amy Wax, apparently. So try this parable out. A reckless driver runs a stoplight and hits a pedestrian, injuring her spine. Doctors confirm the pedestrian that if she is ever to walk again, she'll have to spend many painstaking years in physical therapy. Clearly, she bears no responsibility for her injury. She was victimised by a reckless driver. Yet the driver cannot make her whole. He might pay for her medical bills, for instance, but he cannot make her attend her tedious physical therapy sessions. Only she can do that. Still, she might resist. She might write historical accounts detailing precisely how and why the driver injured her. When her physical therapists demand more of her, she might accuse them of blaming the victim. She might wallow in the unfairness of it all. But this will change nothing. The nature of her injury precludes the possibility of anyone besides her healing it. This is from a black man in America that I'm quoting for everyone ready to send in the racist taunts. Just bear that in mind where it comes from. It's a good parable.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Let me see how we go. We're going all right here. I think that might be a good point to sort of, there's other topics we could deal with, but I reckon, 12th man, without making the episode too long, probably an hour and 10 minutes or something there, but that's kind of the nutshell. The only other thing that we might talk about is often sort of I've found that Indigenous achievements of historical nature seem to be beaten up and exaggerated, it seems. That, you read stories where, AFL football has its origins in the game that the local Indigenous people were playing.
I don't think many people are persuaded by that story, do you?
Yeah, or that Indigenous people were these amazing astrologers and mathematicians.
Oh, that's the one that I find just unbelievable. That they're now called. They're not just people who looked at the stars. They're now called astronomers. They're called Indigenous astronomers.
And sure, they may have an understanding of patterns in the sky, etc.
Yes, but did they know what stars were? I very much doubt it.
These things seem to be beaten up where people feel a need to sort of overstate,
and grossly exaggerate
the achievement of Indigenous people. And I just say to them, you don't have to. Indigenous people discovered what they did, built what they did, achieved what they did to suit the conditions of where they were. I mean, this was a country with poor soil, but a certain type of vegetation and animals, and They survived quite well with what they were doing. Yeah. And so it's no shame to...
I think it's quite patronising, to be honest. It's like when your neighbour brings their child over and says, do you know what my son did today, my 2-year-old? He built this great sandcastle, and you go, oh, gee, that's terrific.
Right, yeah. So,
it's a magnificent structure, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so patronising to, as you say, to grossly inflate the achievements when, compared with just about, the technological culture of just about any other part of the world, they were very rudimentary. Their technology was extremely rudimentary.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with it at all. And it's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed about.
Yes.
This is world history.
Yes.
And I think we all benefit from just being honest about it all. I mean, it's not as if we prance around saying, oh, gee, our European ancestors, weren't they amazing compared with everybody else?
Yes.
I mean, to me, I see the whole of humanity's achievements as the achievements of humanity, not the achievements of Germans or Japanese or whatever,
Yes, yeah. So sure, these things are of interest, but boy, they do seem to be beaten up.
And don't you...
And I could go into detail about them, but I won't in the interest of keeping this podcast at a reasonable level. And there's a sort of a tinge of the nastiness to it, which it's a minor matter in the scheme of the bigger issues that we've explored. And the other one, just at the sideline, was just that Indigenous people are painted as great ecological custodians of our land who kept it in a pristine condition that we, of course, now are ruining. And, of course, our record now is very poor, but it's without doubt that Indigenous people on arriving in Australia wiped out all of this large, slow-moving...
The megafauna.
Megafauna, lovely fairy balls of protein.
I'm not
again,
sure that's really been proven one way or another.
Yeah,
but
in my readings it has.
Oh, really?
But yeah. And the vegetation was changed dramatically by fire burning. I mean, there was a lot of firing going on, and it's not a criticism.
Yeah.
It's just the way that they conducted things. Yeah. But then to turn around and to claim that they were great conservationists and kept the land pristine in the condition that they found it, and understood the changes that could be made to a landscape and didn't is just another sort of sideline issue. But
there's another issue, and that's what you were saying about culture. How if Jewish people talk about business all the time over the dinner table, their kids are going to grow up with those concepts already learned. Now, what I've read about the Jewish history, what little I've read, is that hasn't always been the case, and that came about as a result of certain historical expulsions by certain European countries, where at some point they would be happy to have Jewish people in their community or living on the fringes of their communities because they served a good purpose. At other times they decided they didn't want them anymore, and they would tell them to get lost. And there was a migration from France, I think, into Eastern Europe, like Poland and Lithuania and countries like that at some point several hundred years ago, where the Poles and the Lithuanians, I think it was, suddenly decided that it would be good for their local economy to have Jewish people come and help them and assume certain roles. And so while Jewish people didn't always undertake those specialised roles as moneylenders or whatever, they learnt that it was to their advantage to pursue those occupations, and they did.
Yeah, my understanding as well is that they were in many areas banned from owning land.
Yes,
and that they had to resort to trades. Manufacturing.
But Jewish people in other parts of say, North Africa or the Middle East didn't. They didn't take on the same specialised roles. So my point is culture is learned, and it's not fixed, and it can be changed. And so, why can't Indigenous people, and of course they can change their culture. And yet, one thing that I suppose have objection to is this idea that Indigenous culture is rigid or unchanging, and that they have to protect it and preserve it at all costs. Obviously they don't. And if it's in some aspects disadvantageous, why not change it?
Yeah. The other thing as well, a little sideline as part of all this, is just the respect paid to Indigenous spiritual beliefs that we don't give to Christian,
indeed,
Muslim or other religions. Like, you'll find people on the left who would be appalled at the idea of, and rightly so, the Lord's Prayer
in Parliament
as spiritual mumbo-jumbo nonsense, yet will happily engage in a smoking ceremony in the foyer. Oh, isn't this wonderful?
Yes. And if we, for example, said, we don't need the smoking ceremony, thank you very much, they'd say, well, that's a bit disrespectful, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
So
why are they special? Because, and we go back through all the issues that we've just been through in this thing. So also we're finding that there's a sort of a magical respect for things like Indigenous healing practices, and we're now finding Indigenous people in our hospitals providing Indigenous healing services, which, we would never allow Chinese medicine in because we'd say it hasn't been proven.
That's right.
But we allow this in, and
so we're just trying to be consistent.
Yes.
Whereas, as we know, some on the left are very inconsistent.
Yes. So there you go. That's in a nutshell our arguments as to Indigenous matters.
And there's a lot more we could talk about.
Indeed. And we could go into greater detail about other stuff, but to keep it in sort of in a reasonable time. And so to any potential Indigenous spokesperson who we invite onto the show, we would have referred you to this particular episode and said, have a listen. And by all means, get in contact if you want to debate any of the particular issues we've raised. Send us a note telling us what you are going to debate, and maybe give us a heads up on what your actual thoughts are and why we're wrong, and then we'll have a debate and convince us that we're mistaken or wrong or something like that. So that would be good. So,
I think I've even changed my mind a little bit on Julian Assange. You know, did you see the Four Corners program about him on Monday night?
No, I didn't.
It was interesting, and look, I don't know, but we can talk about that another time.
Yeah. Do you want to go home, or you just want to go onto general topics now?
I don't mind. What do you feel like?
I don't have any. I don't have them on board. But if you,
no, that's all right. Let's talk about Julian another time.
Okay,
but look, you know.
So, dear listener,
just one more thing I would say, and I have a bit of a problem with the way, you know, other quite well-meaning people, I'm sure, tend to romanticise Indigenous culture as some kind of Garden of Eden, you know, humanity living in harmony with nature thing.
Yep.
Whereas the reality, according to, you know, historical documents, is, you know, it may have been quite idealistic in certain very fertile, nice, comfortable niches, environmental niches in Australia, like around the Sydney Basin or, you know, even just about anywhere on the East Coast, I suppose. But in the interior, it was pretty tough going for a lot of Indigenous people a lot of the time. And their culture was not all that kind, for example, to women and girls. Yeah. And from what I've read, being a female in Indigenous culture was often a pretty tough assignment,
indeed,
if I can put it like that. And I've read some pretty horrifying reports about it. So there you go. That's one more aspect that I think people need to put a bit of, you know, put Indigenous culture into a bit of perspective.
All right, that's that issue. So, dear listener, we normally on this podcast run through the topics of the week and
thank the sponsors.
Well, I don't have the list in front of me. Actually, maybe I do. Maybe the patrons don't want to be associated with.
I should say, rather than the sponsors.
Well, yeah. Let's find the patrons. We've got time to do that. Let me just bring them up here and bear with me. Patrons and beer sponsors. So, dear listener,
you're the beer sponsor today.
Yeah, I am the beer sponsor. So, you know, we don't do this for a living. This is a little part-time thing that we do on the side. There are expenses. And I'm clearly going to need to invest in some sort of wireless transmitter on 4G so that I can get this streaming because my phone was tethered and it just didn't do the trick this time. Okay. So we subscribe to a number of newspapers and magazines and there's hosting fees and things. So to help cover the costs, we have patrons. So the way it works is obviously this is free to listen to. You can download it. You don't need any special password. It's all there. And we simply say to you that you're entitled to listen to 20 to 25 episodes, absolutely free. But if at the end of that time you reach the point where you think, gosh, I'm enjoying this podcast, can't wait for it to come out. And we record on Tuesday night. Every Wednesday you're looking and checking your app if it's there and you're excited when it pops up. If you're in that category, we expect you to become a patron and stump up and just $1 a show, US $1 a show.
It's not
all we ask. Less than a cup of coffee a month, probably, and good value, I say. Now, if you don't like that idea and you do enjoy the show, then really what you're doing is you're like the person who would drive through the countryside. You'd see the bag of avocados in the honesty box and would take the avocados and not put any money in the honesty box. So,
and we know you're not like that.
No, you're not. So if you enjoy the program, the podcast, and appreciate the effort that goes into it and see some value in that, then hop onto the website, ironfistvelvetglove.com.au. You'll see some links for Patreon. you can sign up, or you can just do it through PayPal donations. Right. Some people who have done that in the past, some of them as long ago as the 5th of February 2016, was Sean, who was our first.
Well done, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Janelle, Craig, John, Landon, Wayno, Ayame, Alison, Steve, Tony, Caitlin, Watley, Jimmy Spud, Kane, Bromman, Matt J, Robert, Rod, Palais, Maddockman, Dominic, Liam, Dave, Squeaky Wheel, Daniel, Harry, Gavin, Peter, Captain Doomsday, Aidan, Wheatwatcher, Nico, Andy, Murray, Melinda, Adam, Greg, Professor Dr. Dentist, Will, Glenn, Craig, Matthew, Clinton and Alexander. Some people don't like Patreon, so they do it via PayPal. Thank you, Dean. Ken was the beneficiary. Mark, Mr. Anderson and Corinne.
The list is getting longer though, isn't it?
We get a couple, usually once a month or something like that. So I'll give you an example. What are we on? We did quite well in the last couple of months. We picked up about 6 in the last couple of months, so that was good. Also, we have beer sponsors, and thank you to Was, Wayno, Landon, Bronwyn, Dave, Adam, Landon, Caitlin, Zach, Captain Doomsday, and the Iron Fist for tonight.
Good on you.
What else can we say? We've got the website. Look, how are you accessing this podcast? You should be subscribing and downloading in an app. If you're on an iPhone, there's a purple app. Just use it and subscribe. It'll appear automatically. Don't wait for a Facebook notification and then think to just stream it from the website. Like, get an app and just download it, and it happens automatically. That's the easiest way.
And they pay through the Apple Store,
nothing.
do they?
Cost them nothing.
Oh, nothing.
Yeah, the app's free, the thing's free, and it'll just arrive in your in your app. So you should be doing that. You should be on our Facebook page and just sort of liking the page, and that way, when we get this live streaming worked, you'll get a little notification saying they're live streaming, and what you'll be able to do is communicate with us and talk to us and leave messages, and we'll be able to deal with them. So,
and we love feedback.
Yeah, Joe and Watley tuned in while they could, but left, I think, because it was just too difficult. Fair enough. And what else can we say that I want to get out? We've got the website, got the Facebook page. Send us some tips, articles, things like that you might come across. That would be good. People to speak to who you think might be of interest. Point them to our podcast and tell them about it. Even your friends. Like, have you told your friends about this podcast and said, have a listen to this?
Mine.
There you go. That's the hard sell on all those things. Oh, and one other thing. This is actually, now we're getting up to an hour and a half. Do you know I did 2 hours of podcasting before we even started, 12th Man?
How was that?
Today. I was on Cam Riley's podcast, The Bullshit
you?
Filter. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And so we recorded an episode on Boris Johnson.
Oh.
Yes. So
the new clown in town.
Yeah. So if you want more of me, you can go onto Cam's podcast, The Bullshit Filter, and I'm on that one. And we had a look. It was a fun episode, but you probably do need to know and be familiar with their normal show, because there was a lot of in-jokes. So some of it will be lost on you if you're not a regular listener, but it's worthwhile, and Cam does a great podcast, so listen to that one. All right, well, that's the end of this episode of the award-winning Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcasts. 12th Man, as always, you've been magnificent. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.
We'll be back next week, I think, with Scott, and talk to you then.
Yeah. Bye all.
Bye.
See ya.